You can see my committee. I had an awesome committee. They were great to work with, and I was able to work with a lot of people from across campus. So if you have that opportunity, I learned a lot being able to see what other disciplines do. So we'll start off really quickly with what I will establish in this lecture as the definition of grade inflation. There's still some debate about that. Philosophically, and I can understand a lot of the debate. It's over the use of the term inflation, but essentially it's this word: grades are not equivalent for equivalent work over time. And we'll just talk briefly about some of the factors that influence grading. Of course, we have the faculty influence because they're the ones that assign the grades. But there's some parts of that we kind of don't always think of, like department grading practices or policies that they have. Characteristics of the course. A writing course, grading a writing course is different than grading a math class, for instance. But what's mostly focused on in the news, the popular press, and sometimes research is what is referred to as a rater error. And those can be halo or generosity errors. And it's assumed that if a grade is high and there's a problem with it, that's probably why it's high. There's also student influences on grades, of course, how hard they work, the classes they choose to take. Parents, they actually have a pretty good influence on students and how well they do in school, preparing them for college, preparing them for the classes they need to take, nagging to make sure they're in class, kind of thing. And then there's institutional influences, which really hasn't been looked into all that much. Things that affect BYU in particular are the fact that we have a fixed enrollment cap, so we can only admit so many students each year. We have an increasing number of applicants each year, and that's forcing us to become increasingly selective, and my next slide will explain that. I also wanted to look into a policy. There were 2 policy changes that we had in 2011. One removed the ability to retake a course and replace it with a subsequent grade, and the other one was to change the withdrawal date later in the semester. And when they changed these policies, they did not check with the scientists, and they did them at the same time. So their effects are confounded, but we do have the ability to kind of see some information that I think is interesting. So here's the admissions trends. I apologize for the colors. I did not create this slide. The green, if you can kind of see that green is our cap. It's the amount of freshmen that we can enroll every year. It's approximately 7,000 since about 2002 when we had our recent increase. So the green line is right here. It's you can see it's the only line that remains fairly stable. It does go up and down just a little bit depending on where the lines are drawn each year, but it's approximately 7,000. And then the blue line above is the number of applications that we received each year. This year, this was 2015, and as you can see, each year we have an increase. It's been between 800 and 1,000 more applicants each year since the early 2000s. Because of this cap, that means that the number of people that must be denied then also goes up, and it follows a similar pattern as the increase in applicants. So what ends up happening is that we become, as a university, more selective in who we admit. Now that's not because they're deciding that only 30s can come to BYU, but what happens is when you've got 14,000 kids and you stack them all up and you take the top 7,000, that's going to change the qualifications of the students inside the mix. So, yes, question?
When my children applied to BYU, there was a sort of rubric that they could look at saying, here's our standards. So there was a lot of self-selection out. So that actually may be
right.
When was that
the cap
direction put into place where they gave the standards, encouraged people not to apply if they didn't?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I would imagine probably in the late 90s. That's when we started experiencing most of our growth. Up until about, you can actually see too, up until when I first started working in the academic vice president's office somewhere in 06, 07, we were admitting 70 to 75% of applicants, and now we're at 50%, just over a 7-year period. So the growth in applicants is causing all of these changes, and so I would imagine probably in the 90s, that's when it stopped being. Before about in the 90s, before then, it was pretty much most everyone got in, kind of like at some of the other institutions. But BYU, because of resources, has this limitation. Plus, we also have the highest claim rate in the nation. That means when students are given an offer of admittance, they'll accept it. It's kind of like a standby ticket on an airplane. And we have the highest in the nation, which is just above, this year it'll be just above 80%. So here's, how bad is the GPA at BYU? What does it look like? So this is the mean GPA by year for the last 20 years. So at its lowest point, we're looking at a 3.269. At its highest point, which was actually in the middle of the 2000s, the average GPA was 3.348. And the recent date in my study was 2013, and it was 3.37. And so, and this is the reported GPA that we would report on a transcript, for instance. So this crazy rate of inflation from the last 20 years is a difference of 0.068, so it's substantial. And then if you look at the lowest to the highest point, which would be the worst possible scenario, the average GPA was 0.08 higher in the 2000s than it was in 94. This is just raw GPA. So I want to explain also a little bit, as you know, we had this policy where you could retake your classes. So the mean adjusted GPA that's red, I have that as mean adjusted GPA, and that's the GPA as it would be with retaking. It's the GPA counting the retaken classes. So it's generally higher. Students did sometimes retake a class and get a lower grade. That did happen, but this is the adjusted GPA versus what it would have been had they not counted that. So this dramatic difference between those two. The minimum difference was in 2010, and that was because the policy had been announced in 2009, but was still being partially implemented. But most of the time, the difference was somewhere between 0.08 and 0.1 as far as the people who were, you know, rigging the system and getting a better grade. It might be as high as 0.1 higher. In my research, we just decided to go with the reported GPA, which would be equal to this upper line, which then becomes the same as this lower line in 2011 when the policy was implemented. So our incoming freshmen each year also are increasing. Yes?
You might talk a little bit about why that policy was changed.
So the policy was changed for a couple of purposes. One purpose was the federal government decided that if a student takes a class, and let's say they're on student aid, federal aid of some kind, Title IV, if they take, let's say they take American Heritage and they get a C in that class, but they decide they really, really want an A, or they get an A- and they want an A. That happens too. Well, the federal government decided that they shouldn't have to pay for the second time because it wasn't good to count that grade again. So in order, but at BYU, yes?
Over 20 years?
Like at all. Like if you're a student and you take a class and you're on federal aid and you got a C in a class, and then the next semester you're also on federal aid and you want to retake that class but you passed it, they don't want to have to pay for it. If you failed it,
By federal aid, do you mean student loans?
federal aid, student loans or Pell Grants, any type of Title IV assistance. So, what would have to happen is the university would have to then go back and take money away from students, and they found it's very unsuccessful, and people get grumpy about it. So they don't like to do that. And so, because we don't report it till the grade has been processed, which is at the end of the semester. So by unwinding it the way we have it now, the two classes, even though you take American Heritage and then you take it again, they're counted as two separate courses. Which, by the way, I would like to put out there, people need to get this misconception out of their mind. We don't average the grades together. They're all accrued and kind of just aggregated along. So in a sense, you might count them as averaged, but we don't go in and average the two classes and give the grade. It's just simply an additional class that's just added on to the pile.
So it's average because it's considered a new class.
Right, so it is in a sense, but not like we don't average those two together. It's just simply an additional class.
Twice instead of once.
Right. It would be like taking this course multiple times. It's just another semester. They don't average all of your 692 together to give you one grade.
I thought that's what the federal government was trying to prevent from happening.
No, what they didn't want was one class replacing another, and that's, so they don't mind, they have no problem with it being added on because that's how other universities do it. They didn't like the fact that it was completely, it was taken off the calculations and put back on. It still remained on the transcript, but it wasn't, what ended up happening is like a ghost class because they didn't get credit for it, but it was on their because essentially what happened is that someone historically then, 2 semesters ago, needed to pay back money that was from those prior semesters because that class didn't exist anymore. So it was kind of complicated. And at the same time, the registrar's office had been petitioning to increase the withdraw date to match up with what a lot of the other peer institutions have, which is more middle of the semester. So the withdraw date now is past to the point where a student, if they attend up to the withdraw date, there won't be repercussions financially, and because they will have attended long enough to get credit. But that's complex, and we can talk about that after if you really want to know the details on that. But I got a lot of data, so we got to hurry. So mean ACT by year, I started my study in '94. The average ACT was 26.8. By the way, 20 years prior, it was 23. So it's actually just linear, which is kind of amazing considering that the cap is 36. That's the end. Even though we're approaching the ceiling, it's still it's a continuous trend. What isn't told in this story, so here's the increase of 1.6 points. This is 89.1% nationwide historically at that point in time, and now our average incoming freshman is performing at the 94th percentile in the United States. What isn't telling in this story is the standard deviation is substantially smaller now than it used to be, which means the variety of students, the low end of the students is much higher than it ever was. The baseline is somewhere around 25, 26. So, and each freshman class is smarter or more qualified than the preceding class. So. As measured by this. That's why I said smarter with the little quote thingies. So as measured by ACT. They're more prepared for school. So this is an interesting statistic we decided to include because we wanted to try to show the quality of the students that are coming into BYU. And so we decided to include the number of AP credits accepted by the freshmen who are coming in. Now this is a little bit of an iffy statistic because over the years BYU has dramatically reduced the number of AP credits that they will accept. So for instance, back before, I think this might be the drop when, that might be the year when they changed, you only can get a 4 or a 5 on the English exam to get out of writing, where before you could get a 3. But now it's only 4 and 5. And in some cases it's only a 5, and in some cases they don't accept it at all. So it's interesting to see that the number is still going up pretty strong. And even though we are limiting, it's much more severe what we do accept. So in the lowest point in '94, no, I guess it's just in the beginning, 45% of freshmen came in with AP credits. And last year it was almost 60%, or in 2013, 60% came in with AP credits that were accepted. So there was a previous study, Danny Olson, he's an alum of the department. He also did a study on the previous 20 years. He looked at it slightly differently. He compared it college to college, and he came up with an estimated grade of what the students should be earning in those classes, and then compared it with their actual grade, and then decided if that college had structural grade inflation or deflation based on the ratio. And some of the colleges had inflation and some of them had deflation, which meant that the grades were lower than would have been expected. It's the most cited or most looked at study from the department. Isn't that what you said, Dr. Subriggs?
I don't know if it still is, but for many years it was the most,
It was a hot topic.
most cited dissertation from IP&T.
It was definitely something people are interested in.
Maybe yours will look good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That'd be awesome. I'll tell you where to download it soon. So just briefly, I'll go through the literature. I was disappointed to find that there wasn't as much research, solid research. There's lots of talking heads, lots of philosophizing, and the sky is falling, lots of newspaper articles about this presumption that there's grade inflation across the United States. But I did a lot of research and found that very little of it was actually based in hard research. And the studies that were out there were quite small, very narrow, over a few periods, maybe a few years. The ends were small. And so I was kind of skeptical of that. There is a nationwide study that is often cited from a retired professor from Duke. It's on that gradeinflation.com website. The interesting thing about his dissertation, or his paper that's been cited all the time, is that he studied grades over 30 years, but he used it as his sources, reports on websites or other research. So he's just getting data from a website, so he's not sure what it means standard-wise. It's just reported data that's been reported, or in newspaper articles. And at 1 year he had 37 different institutions, and at least he had 13. So he only had between 13 and 37 institutions per year. And there's over 3,000 institutions of higher education, so it's a little thin. It's not necessarily representative. And he never got more than 3 years consecutive data from any one institution. So I'm just skeptical of the data. Now, on the other hand, Cliff Adelman was the head of the NCES, and he did a study in the early 2008, I think it was, where they actually spent 3 years analyzing transcripts that were reported to the government, and they found 80 or 90 different ways to do grading. They assimilated them all, and the long story short with them is they found a slight increase in the late 80s and 90s, but it also correlated with the increase in the number of women coming into higher education. And so it likely has a correlation with the fact that there were more females in higher education, and females statistically get higher grades than males do. Males perform better on standardized tests, and women perform better in the classroom, statistically. I got that look. So it holds up here at BYU. It really does. So it was really kind of shocking to find that so many people are basing so much information on such thin data, and it's disappointing that we do that. So I spend a lot of time telling you what, in my dissertation, I spent 1.5 pages describing the population that's being studied. So we're looking at students at BYU, undergraduate students only. So these are courses taken by undergraduate students over a 20-year period here at BYU. That includes if they took a graduate course, if they were an undergrad. That does include those grades. So I want to explain something to you, though, when you look at this chart, because it looks a little bit different. You'll notice that the standard deviations are really small. That's like shocking to see how small they are, and it's because this is the mean of group means. And so I want to explain to you the unit of observation that we used in this study was I categorized the 12 colleges, 11 colleges into 3 philosophical grading groups for their grading philosophy. I'll show that in a subsequent slide. And then I also broke down by upper and lower division courses. So 1 and 200 level courses were in one group, and 3 and up were in the other group. Most were 3 and 4. There were a few 500 level courses. And then we, of course, by semester and then by year. So these are means of, so a unit of observation would be like lower division, normative graded courses, fall semester, 2000. So that would be 1 unit of observation, for instance. So these are means of means. And you'll notice that the standard deviation is fairly consistent, except for from 2000 on, you might notice that the standard deviation does start to increase a little bit, which is kind of surprising, unless you know, oh, there was a policy change that year. So we'll have to take a look at that a little bit later and see what happens. So as I mentioned, these were some of the variables that we wanted to use in our regression to predict, to see what was, see if we could explain what was happening with grades and this rampant inflation that we were experiencing of a 0.08 increase. So we looked at ACT scores of incoming freshmen. We looked at AP credits of incoming freshmen. We looked at the activity indices. So the faculty understand what this is. The faculty index is the ratio of faculty in each department that are publishing at least one peer-reviewed publication per year, and it's of those faculty who are expected to publish. Our theory, we didn't have a lot of other variables to kind of data to look at, but we thought it could be that professors who are publishing a lot would be maybe have lower, they might have lower time spent with students and the students might get lower grades, or it could be the other way around where the more they publish, the more knowledgeable they are in their field and the better grades their students get. We wanted to see if it had an impact. We also incorporated student evaluations of teaching. We got some really interesting data there. There were 4 different periods of the way the student ratings instrument was done during that 20-year period of time, including paper. So it was a really crazy time, and so that was kind of interesting to incorporate that data, and we had some interesting results. And then, of course, the policy change in 2011. So I told you I would show you, this is how I classified each of the college grading philosophies. So fine arts, humanities, nursing, and education I put into a what I called mastery-based. The idea that students could have, generally, not in every class, but generally, the college philosophy was that students had multiple opportunities to achieve a standard that was set by the teacher before the class started. And the normative group, life sciences, phys, math, and merit school, I considered those, I labeled them as normative in that they had students were ranked according to how they performed in the class compared to each other. And many of them have set points for their mean scores for their classes. So those were the ones that I put in normative, and everybody else I just put in other because they were a combination of the two or some form of criterion referenced. And we are,
Kirsten,
yeah.
you should explain that you didn't do that without.
Right. So I interviewed I interviewed all of the associate deans, one associate dean from each of the colleges, plus a faculty member or two, and we together decided how to classify their grades. And so they understood that this was certainly, every college has classes and departments who function in one of the other groups. So this was just a 30,000-foot guesstimate. But it still turned out to be pretty good. I think we were pretty good. And the interesting thing is it ended up, I didn't start out this way, it ended up dividing the campus into approximately thirds. And the numbers will actually come out that way too. Even though there's 4 colleges up here, it actually comes out to thirds. And we actually are now doing some follow-up studies. We're working right now with engineering, and then we're moving next to family, home, and social sciences. We're going to do some follow-up with just their colleges. So here's the model. I used the regression model. I love regression. You will love it, I promise. So I want to explain what each of the parts of the formula are, and I have my notes here so I don't forget. So the alpha here, that was the mean GPA of each of those observational groups. There's 6 of them, the normative lower, normative upper, the other lower, and other upper, that kind of a thing.
That's the intercept in her regression curve.
Right, it would be, because each of them had their own. So then the betas, we had several of those. One was the faculty research, which is the activity indice over time. We also had student evaluations of teaching, and the AP credits, number of AP credits. Now you'll notice that this is missing something. Do you know which one that it's missing? Does it stand out to you? ACT.
Gamma.
So the ACT, I'm missing gammas here. The ACT is missing. The reason we ended up not including ACT is it provided no additional information. We could have, but it made no difference statistically, so we tried to simplify it. So we initially did have it, but it didn't add any additional information.
It turned out to be highly correlated with the number of AP credit hours a student
Right.
got. The AP was a better predictor.
Actually, the AP credit hours, shockingly enough, was a better predictor than ACT, which is kind of a shocking to me. I had not expected, knowing that we restricted so much more from what we usually accept. So the number of AP credits is what we decided to keep between those two variables. Student evaluation teaching, this is the current instrument, well, not the current instrument, but the last current instrument, the non-new one. And then the effective previous SET instruments, we just wrote that there, but it's complicated, and if you really want to see it, come talk to me and I'll send you to Dr. Grimshaw, because it's pretty complex how we had dummy variables and it's kind of crazy. So then down here when we got gamma, that was the semester. So we actually decided to throw in fall semester, winter semester to see if that made a difference between the grades. Theta is the policy change. Now we have also here phi. We decided to include the policy interim period. So there was a period of time between 09 and 11 when the policy was announced, but it wasn't fully implemented. So there was this partial, we saw there was a statistically significant effect during that period. So we decided to include it. And then of course you've got epsilon, which is our residual, which is, this is what we're looking for, to see what's left over to show what the inflation is with all these other things taken into account. So my research question 1 was, how does the GPA, the mean GPA, differ between all of these 6 major groups, the upper and lower division of each of those? And it turned, well, there's supposed to be a, so it turned out that they were all quite different from each other. The interesting thing that we found on this slide was that the difference between upper and lower division mastery and upper and lower division of the other category was fairly consistent between the two of them, but there was a much bigger difference between the upper and lower division of the normative courses. So students in the upper division courses tended to get much better grades than their sisters in the other grading philosophies, and the lower got lower grades. So they were significantly different from each other. This is an interesting chart here that I think is probably one of the most important parts of my dissertation. So over a 20-year period of time, I consolidated all of the credit hours taught by that college. So a student credit hour would be 1 student in 1 class for 1 hour. So that was how I was able to combine them all and try to see who teaches what and in what proportion. So I took lower versus upper and then also the total. And you'll notice that when you look at the total, while I divided them up in these 3 groups, it's interesting to see that some of these courses, as you know, tend to teach more classes than others. So this is the thing I find interesting. School of Education and nursing are 2 historically picked on colleges, in my opinion. The research, the literature always points to them as the cause of grade inflation in higher education. Well, I would say to you that that's really shocking, considering that they have barely 3% of all the grades ever given to BYU over a 20-year period. So that's not who's impacting the grades. It's actually Family, Home, and Social Sciences and Religious Ed. The 2 of them together make up 1/3 of all student credit hours on campus. Then you'll also notice when we break it up by upper and lower division, you'll see that we do teach slightly more lower division courses than upper as far as percentage-wise. But the thing that's interesting to note here is, like, let's look at the McKay School of Education. So they teach 21,000 lower division student credit hours and 112 upper division. That's a 6-to-1 ratio. But if you look over here at Phys Math, it's actually 1-to-4. It actually goes the other way around. So a college like McKay School of Education, that teaches the vast majority of their classes in upper division credits, is going to have a higher mean GPA, just because that's the way it goes, because upper division classes have higher mean GPAs for all the reasons we can all assume. And someone like Phys Math that teaches a lot of lower division courses, they have low mean GPAs for the college because they teach a tremendous amount. I think when I did Phys Math, if you look at this on the whole, they teach 20% of all lower division courses are taught by Phys Math. So kind of changes things up a little, in my opinion. So research question 2 was, what factors other than the policy could be associated with the variability in grade trend? And so this was the mean AP credits, the faculty activity indices, and the student ratings overall. And you'll notice what happens when we look at student ratings. It's not significant at all. But we did find, as an aside, we did find that student ratings had highly correlated with the type of grading philosophy of the college. That was an interesting, yes?
Which majors had the lowest GPA?
Which majors had the lowest GPA? The lowest GPA would be, if we go back here, would be the norm. So majors, you would be looking at, well, I didn't really do majors, I did the classes. So it would be majors that take a lot of classes in this normative area, which that would tend to be anything in Phys Math, life sciences, or the Marriott School. They tended to have the lowest GPAs, but I didn't look at majors, I just looked at courses. It's a lot easier to look at courses. Yes?
If you're saying normative, you know, I had heard, so this is complete mythology, that, for example, economics department actually mandates a curve for their grades. So when you're saying normative, is that an assumption?
Yes, that's an
And
assumption.
so, I mean, if they mandated ahead of time that you have to give those, it would seem that that's very logical.
Correct.
Your outcome would be.
Right, and that's exactly true, and that's what we're seeing.
All colleges in that category aren't that strict.
Right, that's
And
true.
you didn't separate the departments out.
By normative, it means that they compare students against each other. It doesn't necessarily mean they have a normal curve.
Right.
Some do, some don't.
Oh, you
For-
mean they don't mandate?
Like life
They
sciences
grade
does
them.
not mandate grades, but they do rank students, and they find natural breaks to assign their grades. So they don't necessarily mandate. And actually religious ed does to some point too, but I threw them in the other category because their goal mean GPA is 3.4, and that's substantially higher than the mean GPAs that are dictated by the other colleges, which would be more like in the 2.8s. And so I put them in the other category because they were weird and I didn't want them to mess up the data. We'll look at them separately. So any other questions on this? And again, this is a rough thing. For instance, economics is in FHSS, which was thrown into the other group. So they wouldn't have counted. Well, they do, but in the other category. So, so here, mean AP credits was statistically significant, and so, but the difference is practically significant. Its practical significance is pretty much negligible because it's only a 0.008 increase, depending on, you know, each AP credit you bring in will bring it up. So it's interesting. I think the most interesting thing about this was that none of these were really very useful, and we did find, though, like I said, with student ratings, that they fell along the lines of their grading philosophy. That's another paper.
Well, notice that the effect of the faculty index is negative.
Yeah, that's true. It is the faculty index.
Negligible, but
And it's not a strong it's not a strong P, but it is a slight negative. So theoretically, the faculty is spending a lot of time doing their research. They're spending maybe less time with their students, or they're grading them harsher. It was interesting to note that in the research, this is an aside, departments that had PhDs, that offered PhDs as one of their degree programs, tended to be harsher graders than departments that did not. And that wasn't at BYU, that was just a study done somewhere else. I think they just have higher standards, maybe. Okay, so we'll try to get through this really quickly. So we did find that this is the semester. So One of the other things we wanted to look at was there a difference between fall and winter semester. There is a slight difference between when you take a lower division normative course. If you take it winter semester, you will probably get 0.009 grade lower. That was kind of interesting.
Not one student, but on the average.
On the average, yeah.
20 years across all.
20 years across all time. It was just kind of interesting. Otherwise, there's no. Yeah, exactly. But if you do them all, you might get it up to like 0.01 maybe, you know, if you combine them all.
6.5 million grades average.
Yeah, we average 6.5 million grades. So it's kind of, so it's interesting to see the numbers you get. You can make anything happen with that, right? So, so this research question was what happened with the policy change? What did the policy change do? Because the assumption was at the administrative level that the two effects would probably cancel each other out, because one would have a positive effect and one would have a negative effect. Yes, Charles?
When we're talking about the estimated change in GPA, we're talking about the GPA in a course, not the overall GPA? Or are you talking about the change in overall GPA?
This would be change in, that's a good question, overall GPA?
Meaning the university
Yeah. So if on average the AP credits went up by 1 point, on average the university GPA would increase by 0.08. 008, sorry. Right, did I say that right? It's kind of weird because there's groups inside groups inside groups. So again, this isn't the individual student. So the changes in the policy change, there's two that ended up being statistically significant. Again, practical value is not excessively high, although it was interesting with normative student, and you'll notice that the effect went in opposite directions. So while the policy date, the change happened at the same time, two policies were changed, but I think I'm assuming that we can see the effect of those two policies affecting different groups of individuals. So for instance, the normative division students who then are assuming they can retake that course to get a higher grade, it impacted them negatively because now they can no longer replace that lower grade with a higher grade. Where the mastery lower division, it ended up increasing their grade because students had more time to be able to withdraw from the class. So. But I could theorize on that too, but we're running out of time. So we wanted to know year trend. So the data, GPA data is linear, and every year, every semester is closely correlated with the preceding and following semesters, because it's the same group of people essentially. We didn't actually model the error, but we wanted to be able to model the trend, to be able to predict into the future. So we wanted to explain what has happened in the past, but we also wanted to create some ability to predict where are we going from here. So we tried overlaying some of the polynomial models on, this is just lower division normative data points. So it's just one of those 6 groups. And we tried laying over it some of the different polynomials. And while some of them were somewhat adequate to explain the current data, they did a really lousy job of predicting into the future because we just really don't expect GPA is going to dramatically plummet or shoot up like that. So we tried to find what another solution we could do, and Dr. Grimshaw suggested we use what's called B-splines. So for the B-splines, what happens is you create an interior and exterior knot that are like fixed points that you kind of clip the series. So you would clip this polynomial, and then each segment can have its own movement depending upon what fits best for it. So it breaks it into chunks. So we created internal and external knots, where the boundary knots were at the beginning of the study, and then we created the other boundary knot at the policy change date in 2011. And then each of them has a slightly different internal knot depending on the shape, because as you can see, so this is normative, upper and lower division courses, that's their grade trend. And here's the lower division grade, the mastery grade trend, and other had its own too, but we're just going to show this. And so depending on where to get the curves to fit to match the current data, we moved this internal knot just slightly. So it's somewhere around the year 2002, generally, give or take, is what it is in each of these to try to model the yearly trends so that we could then, as you can see, give us a decent predictor for the future. So all of that taken aside, the bottom line is what everybody wants to know, is there grade inflation at BYU? So the answer is not really, it depends. That's what I think it is. So we did find that mastery-based courses do have a steady, mastery-based upper division courses do have a steady increase in GPA. However, if you look at the numbers here on the side, it's again a small amount. I had to, it's 3.0 to 3.6. So the scale is really reduced. If we went out to a 4.0 to a 2.0, it would be a lot flatter of a line. So it is a slight increase of 0.1% over the 20-year period is what it kind of works out to be for upper division mastery students. Now, by the way, this is residual, and I always remind people this could also be learning. It's just what we haven't taken into account. We haven't taken into account the other qualities of the student or of the faculty or of the resources here at the university. Those could have an impact that we just aren't measuring. Interestingly enough, for the other, for mastery upper and lower, or mastery lower and normative upper and lower, you can see that there may have been a little bit of an increase in the late 1990s, but then once we hit early 2000s, they tend to have been plateauing, and they could in some ways be seen as trending down. It's hard to know because as in the middle of these trends you have, this is the date of the policy change, and this is the interim policy period. So there was a little bit of moving around when it had to do with the policy change. And there had only been 3 years since the policy change, so we can't see what a long-term effect of that is. But we assume that the grade trends will generally continue what they were before. But that's actually fairly flat. So we use some predictive values to forecast. I'll skip over those, but this is what we are predicting for the future. It follows very similarly to the yearly trend that we saw on the other slide. That this would be essentially the dotted line is winter semester, the solid line is fall semester. You can kind of see what the grade trends tend to be, you know, and somebody could argue whether or not they really think those mastery lower division courses are going to actually go down like that or not. Again, you can see right here, there's the gap between upper and lower division mastery. Here's the gap between upper and lower division normative, and you can kind of see where that gap. Other fit right in here and right in here, so the other group fit in the middle there too. Recommendations for practice, or for research, we're going to, well, there's a lot of things we're going to do, but we really want to look at some of these things, looking at what happens when you remove the students who fail from those curves. What does that do to faculty? Because that helps faculty then award higher grades when they've got those failing students. And then we also want to look a little bit further into SET scores and the correlations between that and grading philosophy. It actually correlated very strongly with grading philosophy and not necessarily with grades. Grades actually correlated with grading philosophy. So it's that whole thing of A and B are correlated, but it's because they're correlated to C kind of a thing. So recommendations for practice, nothing shocking here except for I just think everybody needs to understand this information when we're comparing colleges. So apples aren't always apples. Sometimes they're oranges and nectarines, or as we refer to it, fruit salad. So each college is slightly different. It has its own different mix. If they're a college that teaches mostly lower division courses, they're going to have lower GPAs on average. So perhaps we should tear those out and report grades based upon the level of the course that's being taught, or find other ways to kind of make it a little bit more fair or even. And that's where you can download it. So questions? Dr. Sudwigs can add anything you want me to.
Except an announcement we want to make before people leave. Let's take the question.
Question? Charles?
How was your data received by people who care about grade inflation at the university?
Well, so far it hasn't gone above our the AAVP office with Brad Niger, but he is interested in it. It's just trying to fit it into a busy schedule. But it certainly has, we've found it to inform us as we've worked on the student ratings, the new student ratings instrument, for instance, when we were looking at, particularly where we're looking at comparing colleges to each other, and to compare faculty within departments to each other, that kind of a thing. Do you want to talk to that at all, Dr. Sedgwick? So, but I'm hoping to increase. You have to be careful how you do it. I'm working on it. Yeah.
Do you have plans to publish this? Is it out in review somewhere?
We're working on that. I'm working with two very busy faculty, but yes, we plan on publishing actually 2 papers from this. We want to publish one paper that has more of an administrative point of view that kind of talks about the overall idea, because a lot of the papers that are out there and the information that administrators are getting is over this raw GPA and this blatant inflation of 0.08 for over a 20-year period of time, and they feel, oh, this must be a problem. But then to be able to show them that there actually are ways that you can look at this problem within your institution and see if grades are changing or not. So, good question.
Could the differences in GPA between genders be explained by the typical classes a male and female takes?
Part of it, potentially. There's actually a lot of research on that, and I didn't really go into it, but there's a good amount of research that shows when you take the courses into account, females still tend to get higher grades in their coursework, and that males perform better on standardized tests like ACT or SAT, which is
You compare males and females
in the same course, taking the same classes. Females tend to score higher GPAs, but males score better on tests.
By the way, everything she's talked about here is only undergraduate grades.
Correct.
There's nothing in here about
Nope.
grades in graduate school.
Graduate schools are kind of their own baby. I think this has implications for areas outside of this university too. Not only should institutions maybe look at their own grading practices this way, but think about this. So the papers are saying, oh, the community colleges have really rigorous grades, and the Ivy League schools have rampant grade inflation. But if you think about it, Ivy League schools tend to have a higher proportion of 300 and 400 level courses. They have higher qualified students who are being admitted. So they have a different group of people that they're teaching than the community college that generally has 100 and 200 level classes. They take students that are maybe ill prepared for those higher educations. And so you just can't go in and say, well, percentage of grades is different, because an A at one institution, an A at Slick, is different than an A here or an A in Harvard. Things are going to be, qualifications to get into that point are different, qualifications to get that A are different, and we all know that. So I think it's naive for newspapers to say, oh, you know, higher education, particularly the selective schools, have rampant grade inflation. Well, it could just be that they just have higher qualified students. Yeah.
To look at class size, because undergraduate level classes tend to be larger auditoriums.
Mhm.
Teacher doesn't have any relationship with any of these students, they're just names, versus the upper division one
Right.
aspect is that they are smaller.
I didn't look at that in particular, but that certainly is a factor of why those lower division courses tend to have lower grades. And there's a multitude of factors. They're also generally taught by younger faculty. They're, you know, the adjuncts, or not necessarily here, but nationwide, they're taught by adjuncts. They're taught by the assistant professors. They're taught by the young faculty, where the full professors are teaching grad courses, upper division classes. Class size, age of the student, it has an impact. Whether they've served a mission or not has an impact. We didn't look at any of the student characteristics. We simply looked at grading philosophy characteristics. It was fun. You could look all day, but I was already dealing with 6.5 million grades, you know, conglomerated onto the grading philosophies. So, but I would, yeah, that's be fun to tear that apart.
And what statistical package did you do all your analysis in?
We used R. So this was done in R. Yay, R.
So, one announcement we wanted to thank you, this is apart from your.
No, rest.